The bullet hole in the wall of the Dusty Creek Saloon had been there for 3 years, and Abigail Langley had always thought it served as a fine reminder that the world was not a gentle place. But nothing had prepared her for the moment Levi Sheridan walked through the swinging doors with blood on his shirt and defiance in his dark eyes, and changed the entire course of her life without so much as asking permission. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Harlow's Crossing sat in the sun-baked flatlands of West Texas like a stubborn old mule that refused to move no matter how hard the wind pushed against it. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, bringing with it a rush of new settlers, traveling merchants, and the particular brand of lawless ambition that tended to follow opportunity wherever it ran. The population had swelled from a dusty handful of ranchers and shopkeepers to something approaching 400 souls, each one with a story and a need, and most of them with more pride than sense. Abigail Langley was 24 years old, and she had been running the Harlow's Crossing post office and general store since her father, Edmund Langley, had succumbed to a fever the previous autumn. Edmund had been a quiet, principled man who believed in the dignity of hard work and the power of a well-written letter, and Abigail had inherited both his business acumen and his inability to accept injustice quietly. She was tall for a woman of her era, with auburn hair she wore pinned at the nape of her neck, sharp green eyes that catalogued everything they saw, and a manner of speaking that was direct without being unkind. The men of Harlow's Crossing had long since learned that trying to shortchange her on postage or underestimate her intelligence were equally foolish endeavors. She did not consider herself lonely, exactly. She had her friend Clara Whitmore, the schoolteacher, and old Judge Pratt who came by for coffee and conversation every Tuesday morning. She had the rhythms of the store, the sorting of mail, the smell of pine soap and dried tobacco, the satisfying scratch of pen on ledger paper. She had ambitions, too, quiet ones she kept tucked close to her chest. She wanted to expand the store, add a lending library of sorts, create something lasting in a town that still felt like it might blow away tomorrow. What she did not have was a man who had ever interested her enough to look at twice. That changed on the 14th of April, in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning. She heard the disturbance before she saw it, raised voices on the main street outside, the particular quality of argument that meant fists would follow words, and then a single sharp crack that was unmistakably a gunshot. Abigail came around the counter with her hand pressed flat to the wooden surface, her eyes on the door, and a moment later it opened and Levi Sheridan walked in. She recognized him vaguely. He had been drifting in and out of Harlow's Crossing for the better part of 6 months, doing whatever work presented itself, mending fences for the Callaway Ranch, hauling freight from the railhead, filling in at the livery stable when the regular hand was drunk. She knew his name because everyone in a town that size knew everyone's name eventually, but she had never spoken more than 2 words to him. He was perhaps 28 or 29, lean and sundark, with a jaw that needed a razor and eyes the color of strong coffee. He moved like a man accustomed to carrying weight, not just in the physical sense, though there was plenty of that too, but the kind of weight that lived behind a person's eyes and made them quiet in rooms full of noise. He was pressing his left hand to his right side, and there was blood soaking through the worn cotton of his shirt. Abigail did not scream, and she did not flutter. She said clearly and without panic, "Sit down before you fall down. There is a stool behind you." He looked at her with something between surprise and wariness. "I don't want to trouble you, miss." "You are already trouble," she said matter-of-factly. "The question now is whether you are going to be the kind of trouble that collapses on my clean floor or the kind that sits down sensibly so I can see what needs to be done. So sit." He sat. She had him pull up his shirt, and the wound was a graze rather than a through-and-through. The bullet had carved a shallow furrow along his lower ribs, painful and bloody but not dangerous if it was cleaned properly. She had a medical kit under the counter because her father had maintained one, reasoning that a general store in a rough town ought to be prepared for rough circumstances. She cleaned the wound with carbolic solution, while Levi Sheridan sat very still and did not make a sound, though she could see by the set of his jaw exactly how much it cost him. "What happened?" she asked, not because she was prying, but because she needed to know whether she was about to have more trouble coming through her door. "Disagreement with a man named Harker," he said. "He's been running a scheme on some of the smaller landholders out on the creek road, charging them for water rights they already own, threatening their cattle if they don't pay. I told him it wasn't right, and he shot you for the telling. He had a friend do it. He doesn't generally do his own shooting." Abigail tied off the bandage with a firmness that made him inhale sharply. "And who is this Harker?" "His name is Dale Harker. He came in with the railroad money, bought up land on both sides of Mill Creek, and now he's trying to squeeze everyone who needs that water to survive." Levi pulled his shirt back down, moving carefully. "He's got the deputy in his pocket, from what I can tell." This was information Abigail had not had before, and she filed it away carefully. She had heard rumors about troubles out on the creek road. Two families she knew by their mail correspondence had been late with business recently, and she had wondered at it. "You should go to the judge," she said. "The judge is in Abilene until June." "I'm aware of that," she said, sitting back on her heels and looking up at him. "I'm the one who sends his mail." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but the shadow of one, the kind that had not been used in a while and was not entirely sure of itself. "I suppose you would be," he said. He tried to pay her for the bandaging, and she refused, and he argued the point with more earnestness than she expected. And she told him she did not run a medical practice, and therefore there was nothing to pay. He left looking like a man who was not accustomed to receiving help without obligation attached to it, and she watched him go and thought about what he had told her about Dale Harker, and about the fact that Levi Sheridan had apparently been willing to bleed for the principle of telling a bully he was wrong. She thought about that more than she should have, later that night. He came back the following morning, ostensibly to buy a packet of tobacco and a fresh length of rope, and they spoke for 20 minutes about the water rights situation before either of them noticed how much time had passed. He knew the law on riparian rights better than she would have expected from a drifting ranch hand, and she said so. "I read," he said simply, "whenever I can find something worth reading. There is a lending arrangement I maintain here," she said carefully. "My father kept a collection. It is not a library in any formal sense, but people are welcome to borrow." He looked at the shelf she indicated along the back wall, 24 volumes, well worn but cared for. He reached out and touched the spine of a copy of Commentaries on American Law without pulling it from the shelf, as though he did not quite trust himself to ask for it. "You can take it," she said, "as long as you bring it back." He looked at her then, and she had the sudden sensation of being seen very clearly by someone who did not often bother to look at people closely. "Why?" he asked. It was such a simple question, and yet the way he said it carried the weight of something much larger, as though he was not merely asking about the book, but about the basic premise of being treated decently without a catch. It made her chest ache in a way she chose not to examine immediately. "Because it sounds as though you might be able to use it," she said. He took the book. He came back 3 days later with it, and a list of specific passages he had questions about, and she answered them as best she could, and the conversation stretched into the afternoon, and Clara Whitmore came in for her mail and caught sight of Abigail leaning against the counter with her chin in her hand, listening to a sun-darkened stranger talk about water law with quiet, careful intensity, and Clara raised an eyebrow that Abigail deliberately did not acknowledge. That was how it began. Not with grand gestures or declarations. It began with a wound and a bandage and a book, and it grew slowly in the way that real things tend to grow, put down roots before it showed any green at all. Over the weeks that followed, Levi Sheridan made reasons to come into the store. He was employed now more steadily at the Callaway Ranch, having impressed old Harris Callaway with his reliability, and he came into town on most Saturdays, and increasingly on Wednesdays as well. He always bought something. It was never nothing, and Abigail suspected this was a point of pride with him, that he would not allow himself to simply visit without exchange. But the buying was always brief, and the talking was long. He asked about her father, and she told him about Edmund Langley with a frankness that surprised her, about the fever and the loneliness of that autumn, and the particular difficulty of inheriting a business and a grief simultaneously. He listened the way very few people listen, without waiting for his turn to speak, without offering platitudes, just absorbing what she said, and then asking the next quiet question that proved he had understood every word. She learned things about him in return, though he offered them more carefully, the way a person keeps cards close who has been burned before by showing too much. His name was Levi Sheridan, and he was 29 years old, and he had been born in Missouri, and had come west at 17 after his family lost their land to debt. He had worked every kind of labor the frontier offered, from trail drives to mine work to lumber camps in the Pacific Northwest, and he had come back east, relatively speaking, when the high mountain winters proved more brutal than even he could cheerfully endure. He had never stayed anywhere long. He had not, he said once without further explanation, ever felt that staying was something he was particularly entitled to. She wanted to ask what he meant by that. She did not yet. The situation with Dale Harker continued to develop. Levi had taken his information to the state land office via letter, which Abigail had helped him compose, and send with a certainty that the postage was properly attached and the wording was precisely right. Two of the Creek Road families, the Mendozas and the Hartley family, had brought formal complaints. The deputy, a man named Croft who had the particular nervous-eyed look of someone doing things they knew were wrong, had come into the post office once to demand to know what mail Abigail was processing, and she had told him, with the magnificent politeness of someone who knows their legal ground exactly, that she was a federal employee of the Postal Service, and that his jurisdiction did not extend to the contents of her mail unless he had a federal warrant, which he did not. He had gone away. She had shaken slightly for 5 minutes afterward, which she considered a reasonable response to having a man with a badge and bad intentions in her place of business. She mentioned it to Levi the next time she saw him, partly because she thought he should know Harker was paying attention, and partly, she admitted this to herself, because something in her wanted to see how he would react. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Did he threaten you?" Not explicitly, but the intention of intimidation was clear. "I'll speak to him." "You absolutely will not," she said firmly, "because you are not my protector, and I do not need anyone riding to my defense and making things worse. What I need is for the letter to reach the land office, and for the judge to come back from Abilene in a condition to hear a complaint. What I need is patience and process." He looked at her with that careful, measuring quality he had, and she could see him wrestling with something, the instinct to act against the understanding that she was right. Finally he said, "You're a remarkable woman, Abigail." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she felt it land somewhere between her ribs with a warmth she had not been anticipating. She pretended to be very interested in the mail she was sorting. "I am a practical woman," she said. "There is a difference." "I don't think there is," he said quietly. "Not in your case." That night she sat at the small desk in the back room that had been her father's office and now was hers, and she wrote in her private journal, a habit Edmund had instilled in her, and she found herself writing about the quality of Levi Sheridan's voice when he said her name, which was information she had not entirely intended to commit to paper, but which apparently needed to go somewhere. The spring deepened toward summer, and Harlow's Crossing swelled with the heat and the energy that the season brought. The Saturday markets grew rowdy and bright, with cattle traders and traveling shows, and the inevitable poker disputes that followed money wherever it gathered. Abigail was busy, and she was good at being busy, and she threw herself into the expansion project she had been planning, a small reading room at the back of the store, built with lumber she had negotiated for at cost from the Callaway mill. She was overseeing the construction herself, making decisions about measurements and placement with the confidence of someone who had grown up around commerce and understood that the people who got things done were the ones who showed up and did them. Levi came by on a Wednesday and found her on a ladder, measuring the height of the proposed shelving with a length of string and a charcoal pencil. "You need a hand with that?" he asked. "I need someone to hold the other end of this string against the floor mark I've made," she said, "and to call out the measurement while I mark the wall." He held the string. She marked the wall. They worked together for an hour in a companionable silence that was punctuated by practical exchange. And when they were finished and she had come down from the ladder, he looked at her plans spread out on the counter and pointed out that if she moved the east shelving by 8 inches, she would have room for a small reading table and 2 chairs without blocking the natural light from the window, which was the sort of observation that came from someone who had thought about the problem rather than just looked at it. She moved the shelving by 8 inches. The reading table fit exactly where he said it would. They sat at it that evening after the store closed, with the windows still gold from the setting sun, and she served coffee from the pot she kept on the small stove, and they talked until the light was fully gone. He talked about what he had seen in his years of traveling, the injustices that accumulated in a country moving as fast as America was moving in 1882, the way the railroad money reorganized power without much regard for the people who had already been living somewhere when the capital arrived. He talked about it with anger that was controlled into something useful rather than indulgent, anger that had been turned into careful thought. She talked about her father's vision for the store as a community anchor, how he had believed that a place where letters moved in and out was a place where community breathed. She talked about wanting to continue that vision, to build on it. "You will," he said, with the simple conviction of someone stating an observable fact. "You sound very certain for a man who's known me only a few weeks," she said. "Some things don't take long to become certain about," he said. The words sat between them in the evening air, soft and weighty, and she looked at him across the small table and felt something move in her that had not moved before. Not the nervous flutter of early attraction. She had felt that already, but something deeper, the shift of tectonic plates, the kind of feeling that rearranges the landscape. She did not say anything, but she did not look away either. He was the one who broke the quiet, with a careful clearing of his throat and a comment about the lateness of the hour, and he stood and thanked her for the coffee, and took his leave with the contained, deliberate courtesy that characterized everything he did. And she sat at the reading table for a long time after he was gone, watching the lamp light shift. Clara Whitmore came to visit on a Sunday and sat across from Abigail in the back room with 2 cups of tea and the particular expression of a woman who is about to say something direct. "You are falling in love with the drifter," Clara said. "His name is Levi Sheridan," Abigail said, "and he is not precisely a drifter anymore. He has regular employment with Callaway. You just confirmed what I said by defending him." Abigail wrapped both hands around her teacup and looked at the steam. "He is unlike anyone I have met," she said, and the simple honesty of the statement surprised even her. "Is he a good man?" "I believe so. Yes. He is principled in a way that costs him something. That is how I know it is real." Clara was quiet for a moment. "And what does he feel?" "I don't know," Abigail said, which was almost true. Almost. The trouble with Dale Harker came to a head in the first week of June, shortly before the judge returned from Abilene. Harker's men had driven off a portion of the Mendoza cattle and poisoned a section of the creek with something that had been making animals sick downstream. It was deliberate, it was illegal, and it was the kind of escalation that meant Harker was feeling the pressure of the formal complaints and had decided to demonstrate his willingness to go further. Levi came to Abigail the morning after he heard about it. His face was controlled, but she knew his expressions by now, and she could see the anger carefully contained behind them. "I need to go out to the Mendoza place," he said, "to see what's happened and to write up a proper account while the evidence is fresh. Will you help me with the document? You know how it should be worded." "I'll come with you," she said. He looked at her. "It could be dangerous. Harker's men were out there last night." "All the more reason to have a witness who knows how to write clearly and credibly," she said. "I'll get my coat." He looked as though he was going to argue, and then he looked at her and apparently thought better of it. They rode out to the Mendoza place together. She on the sturdy little roan she kept behind the store, him on the bigger gray he had been using for Callaway work, and they spent 4 hours documenting the damage with the thorough attention that would make the resulting affidavit impossible to dismiss. Maria Mendoza, a woman of 40 with iron-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had survived considerably worse than one cattle baron's greed, served them water and dried beef, and told them her family had been on this land for 11 years and was not leaving. "You will not have to," Abigail told her firmly. On the ride back, the late afternoon light laid itself flat and golden across the plains, and the silence between her and Levi was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need filling. She was thinking about the affidavit and about the judge's return, and about the particular strength of Maria Mendoza's voice when she said 11 years, and she was also, with some portion of her mind that refused to be disciplined, thinking about how natural it had felt to ride out here beside him. How right the proportion of it was, his steady gray horse and her quick roan moving at an easy matched pace across the open land. "Thank you," he said when they were almost back to town, "for coming." "For all of it. You would have done it well enough alone," she said. "I would have done it adequately alone," he said. "That is not the same thing." She looked at him sidelong in the orange light. He was looking ahead at the town silhouette against the sky, and the angle of his jaw was clean and serious, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that she recognized now as the specific posture of a man keeping himself in check. "Levi," she said. "Yes." "Are you ever going to say what it is you don't let yourself say?" He was quiet for a long time. The horses moved. The wind came off the flat land with the smell of dry grass and somewhere distant the first evening cicadas. "I am trying," he said finally, "to do the right thing." "I am not certain you know what the right thing is," she said carefully. He glanced at her then, and his eyes held something naked and unguarded that he pulled back almost immediately. "I know what I want," he said, "and I know what I have to offer, and those two things are not equal, Abigail. That is what I know." She thought about this. She did not answer then, because she was turning it over, and she respected both of them enough not to rush something that deserved consideration. They rode the last mile into town in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but was not easy either, and they parted at the edge of the main street with a civility that felt like it was working harder than it needed to. She lay awake that night thinking about what he had said, and the more she thought about it, the more clearly she saw what he meant, and the more clearly she saw that he was wrong. He thought he had nothing to offer because he had spent 12 years being no one particular in no one place particular, because he owned no land and had no family name of consequence, and could not say with certainty that he would be in Harlow's Crossing in 6 months or 2 years. He thought these were disqualifying facts. He thought that choosing him would mean settling for less than she deserved, and she thought about how wrong a person could be while being completely sincere about it. Judge Elmore Pratt returned from Abilene on a Wednesday in the second week of June, and Abigail was waiting for him with the affidavits, the documentation, and the Mendoza family's formal complaint already prepared and organized in the precise and legible hand that he had long since learned to trust. He read everything over 2 cups of coffee at the table in his chambers, which doubled as his front parlor, while Abigail sat across from him and answered his questions, and when he was finished, he set the papers down and said, with the satisfaction of a man who has been given exactly what he needs to do his job, "This is thorough work, Abigail. Your father would be proud." "Can you act on it?" she asked. "I can schedule a formal hearing within the fortnight," he said. "With this documentation, I can also issue a temporary injunction against Harker's interference with the creek access. That will stop the worst of the damage while the larger matter is decided." He looked at her over his reading glasses. "Who helped you put this together? The affidavits are excellent, but the account of the water rights framework is beyond what I'd expect from a single observer. Levi Sheridan contributed significantly to the legal framing, she said. He's a thoughtful man with a good grasp of the law. The judge looked at her for a moment with the knowing look that old men develop when they have spent decades watching people be slightly less transparent than they think they are. He said nothing further on the subject. The injunction was issued on a Friday, and Croft, the deputy, delivered it to Dale Harker looking like a man who genuinely wished he were somewhere else. Harker was not a man accustomed to being checked, and the word around town was that he had raged considerably, and that he had threatened to contest the whole proceeding, and that he had made some ominous comments about people who meddled in his business affairs. Levi came to the store that evening and told her that Harker had sent a man to the Callaway ranch to suggest that Callaway would find it in his interest to let his new hand go. Harris Callaway, who was 70 years old and had survived a Comanche raid in 1865 and a drought that killed half his herd in 1879, had told Harker's messenger precisely where he could put his suggestion, in language that the messenger had apparently found quite clarifying. Levi told this story with the quiet amusement of someone who had been genuinely moved by the old rancher's loyalty, and Abigail laughed, and it was the kind of laughter that happens when relief mixes with affection and finds an outlet. "He is a good man, Callaway," she said. "He is," Levi agreed. "Better than I had any right to expect." She watched him across the counter, the lamp between them making his face half light and half shadow, and she thought that this was the moment. Not a planned moment, not a staged one, just the moment that had been building since that first Tuesday morning when he walked in with blood on his shirt and too much pride to ask for help directly. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her with that stillness of his. "I know what you think," she said. "I think I have known for some time. You think that you are not sufficient, that I would be choosing something lesser if I chose you. That the right thing to do is to keep yourself at a distance because somewhere in your accounting of things, choosing you would be a subtraction rather than an addition." He did not deny it. He looked at the countertop. "You deserve do not," she said, and there was a sharpness to it that brought his eyes back to hers. "You do not get to decide what I deserve. That is not your choice to make. You are not the authority on my life and what it ought to contain. I am." The silence that followed was absolute. "Abigail," he said, and his voice was rough in a way she had not heard before. "You are principled and you are thoughtful and you listen and you act on your convictions even when it costs you something," she said. "You treated the Mendozas as though their trouble was your own because it was the right thing to do, not because there was anything in it for you. You are the most decent man I have encountered in this town or anywhere else, and the fact that you cannot see that does not make it less true." He was very still. "I am not asking you to be certain about the future," she continued, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am not asking you to promise me things that no one can promise. I am asking you to stop making the decision for me. I am asking you to let me decide what I want and who is worthy of my consideration, because it is not your choice. It is mine." He looked at her for a long time. She could see the thing moving behind his eyes, the particular internal argument of a man who has made a habit of self-denial and is being asked to question whether that habit was ever wisdom or whether it was just another kind of fear dressed up as nobility. "What do you want?" he asked, very quietly. "I want to know if you feel what I think you feel," she said. "I want you to be honest with me for once without editing yourself on my behalf." The lamp flame shifted. Outside, the sound of Harlow's crossing moving through its evening voices from the saloon, a horse's distant nicker, the slow turn of the world. "I have been falling in love with you since the morning you told me to sit down before I fell down," he said, "and it has scared me every day since." The words hit her with the force of something true, something she had been waiting to hear named even though she had known it unnamed for weeks. She let out a breath she had not entirely realized she was holding. "It has scared me too," she admitted, "but I am not interested in letting fear do my thinking for me." He came around the counter. She had not expected that. She had expected more conversation, more careful deliberation, more of the measured pace that characterized everything about him. But he came around the counter and he stood very close, and he raised one hand and touched her face with a tenderness so careful and deliberate that she felt it in the very core of her, and he said, "I am sorry it took me this long to stop being a fool." "You were not a fool," she said. "You were scared. There is a difference." "You are generous," he said. "I am accurate," she said, and then she closed the remaining distance between them and kissed him, because she had decided what she wanted, and she was not a woman who waited past the moment for doing. He kissed her back with the same quality that defined everything he did: careful, and then not careful at all, controlled and then completely, honestly present. And she understood in that instant that this was a man who had spent a very long time keeping himself folded small, and who had more warmth and depth in him than she had even guessed, which was saying something because she had guessed considerable. When they separated, she was aware that her heart was conducting itself without consulting her dignity, and she decided that for once this was acceptable. "Now," she said, with the practical tone that she had never entirely been able to set aside even in the most meaningful moments of her life, "I suppose we ought to talk about what happens next." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh fully and freely, and it was a wonderful sound, warm and slightly surprised, as though he had not entirely remembered that laughter was something available to him. "Yes," he said, "I suppose we ought." What happened next was not simple, because nothing in Harlow's Crossing in the summer of 1882 was simple, but it was good, with the particular goodness of things that have been earned through attention and honesty. The hearing before Judge Pratt took place on the 23rd of June, in the large meeting room above the bank that served as the town's closest approximation to a proper courtroom. Dale Harker appeared with a lawyer he had brought in from San Antonio, a slick man in a cream-colored suit who attempted to argue that the water rights documentation was incomplete and the affidavits were circumstantial. Abigail sat in the gallery and watched Levi give his testimony with the calm, grounded authority of someone who had prepared thoroughly and knew that the truth was on his side. Maria Mendoza gave testimony with a dignity that moved several people in the room visibly. The Hartley family's father spoke about his cattle and his livelihood with the plain language of a man who has worked the same piece of earth for a decade and knows every inch of it. Judge Pratt listened to all of it with the complete attention he gave to everything, and when the proceedings concluded he took until the following morning to issue his ruling, which was a thorough and well-reasoned document affirming the established water rights, ordering Harker to cease his interference, and directing that damages be assessed for the cattle and the creek poisoning. The ruling also referred Croft's conduct to the county sheriff's office for review, which resulted, within the month, in the deputy's quiet resignation and departure from Harlow's Crossing in a direction nobody tracked too closely. Harker left as well, eventually. A man of his sort tended to, when the easy advantage was removed. He sold his land holdings along Mill Creek at a considerable loss and relocated to somewhere no one in Harlow's Crossing ever heard from again, and the creek ran clear again within 2 weeks, and the Mendoza cattle were replaced through a community fund that Abigail organized with the same methodical determination she brought to everything she undertook. The community response to that fund was its own kind of revelation. The town of Harlow's Crossing, it turned out, was not as indifferent as it sometimes appeared. People contributed what they could, not just the established ranchers and merchants but the smaller families, the newer settlers, a collection taken up by the Women's Thursday Sewing Circle, a poker game at the saloon where the agreed winnings went to the cause. It reminded Abigail of what her father had always said about communities, that they showed their true character not in the easy times but in the ones that required something of them. In the middle of all of this, she and Levi were finding their way into whatever they were to each other, doing it in the way that the town watched because, in a place of 400 souls, there were no private gestures, only ones that people chose not to comment on directly. He came to the store most evenings now. He had supper with her twice a week at the small table in the back room, which she had begun to think of as their table, and they talked about everything: the practical matters of the water case and the community fund, the books she lent him and he read with the absorbed intensity of someone making up for lost time, the wider world as represented by the newspapers that came through on the mail, the future of the town, the question of the reading room and whether she might eventually organize some kind of regular book discussion that the townspeople could participate in. He fixed things around the store without being asked. He noticed a loose board in the porch and replaced it. He noticed that the stove pipe had a crack and sourced a replacement before she had identified the problem herself. He did these things with a quiet attentiveness that was so different from the showy performances of helpfulness she had encountered from other men who did one thing and then expected considerable acknowledgement, that it took her a moment to even register what he was doing. When she did notice, she thanked him. When he said it was nothing, she told him it was not nothing and that he ought to let himself be thanked, and he looked at her with that slightly undone expression she was learning to love, the one that appeared when someone was kind to him in a way that surprised him. They went riding on Sunday mornings when the store was closed, out into the flat land west of town where the light was extraordinary in the early hours and the world seemed immeasurably large and quiet. She knew these rides were becoming something the town noticed and filed away, and she found she was entirely at peace with that. She had spent 24 years being sensible and self-sufficient and slightly separate, and it turned out that being known, being in something that other people could see, was not the vulnerability she had always assumed it to be. It was a different kind of strength. On one of these Sunday rides in late July, they stopped on a rise that gave a clear view back toward town and forward toward the open country, and he dismounted and helped her down in the old-fashioned way with both hands at her waist, and the courtesy of it moved through her like warmth through cold air. They stood looking at the view, and he said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "I want to stay," he said. "Not just stay in the sense of not leaving. I mean, I want to build something here. If there is a path by which that is possible." He turned to look at her. "I have been talking to Calloway about the possibility of a permanent position and eventually a small stake in the herd. He is not a young man and he has no children, and he has indicated that he would consider an arrangement over time. It would take years, but it would be real." "It sounds like a solid plan," she said carefully. "I wanted you to know," he said, "because it affects things. It affects what I can honestly offer." She looked at him. The wind moved through the dry grass below them and the horizon was enormous and clean. "Levi," she said, "are you asking me something specific or are you telling me about your future plans?" He looked at her for a moment, and she could see the familiar internal negotiation happening, the weighing of words, the careful reaching, and then he stopped negotiating and simply said what he meant. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want your permission to do that formally, and if you will have me in time, I want more than that." She felt the full weight of it, and she let herself feel it, the sweep and seriousness of it. "You have my permission," she said, "and I will tell you that the in-time portion of your proposal is not likely to be as far away as you think." His smile broke across his face completely this time, not the shadow of one but the full thing, and it transformed him, removed 5 years and all the careful containment, and showed her what he must have looked like as a young man before the years had taught him to keep himself small. She thought it was the finest thing she had seen in a very long time. He kissed her there on the rise above the open plains, with the town at their backs and the whole of the uncharted West laid out before them, and she thought that her father, who had believed in the power of a well-written letter and the dignity of staying somewhere and building something good, would have approved of this man enormously. The formal courtship, as he had put it, lasted through the remainder of that summer and into the fall. He attended church with her on Sundays, which she had not been certain he would do, and he sat with the particular contained attention he brought to everything worth attending to. He met Clara Whitmore formally over dinner at the schoolteacher's small house, and Clara questioned him with the thoroughness of someone who loved Abigail and was not interested in wasting her friend's time on someone inadequate. And Levi answered everything directly and without defensiveness. And at the end of the evening, Clara caught Abigail in the kitchen and said, quietly, "He is exactly who you think he is." That is very rare. He met old Harris Calloway as something beyond an employee, as, it seemed, something approaching a son, or what the old rancher imagined a son might have been. Calloway was gruff and plain-spoken, and had absolutely no patience for foolishness, and he and Levi had a relationship built on mutual respect and the shared language of men who understood cattle and land and the long work of building something durable. Abigail liked the old rancher immediately when she met him, and he regarded her with the approving eye of someone who has learned to identify quality and was pleased to find it present. The reading room at the store opened in September, with the 2 chairs Levi had suggested, and a proper oil lamp hung from the ceiling and 16 volumes on the shelves. She had been collecting donations and had received 3 books from the San Antonio Lending Library at reduced cost. The opening was attended by more people than she had anticipated, which she chose to take as evidence of exactly what her father had always believed about communities and their need for gathering places. She held the first discussion group on a Wednesday evening, with Clara, the Reverend's wife, 2 of the younger ranchers' wives, and to her quiet pleasure, Maria Mendoza, who had come into town specifically for the occasion and who turned out to have opinions about literature that were fierce and interesting, and not to be underestimated. Levi sat in the corner with his hat in his hands and listened and said almost nothing, and afterward told her it was the best evening he had spent in years. It was October when he proposed properly. He did it in the store, at the reading table that had always been theirs, over the last of the coffee on a Friday evening after the store was closed. He did not have a ring yet. He told her this directly, with the honesty that she loved about him, because a ring was not something his current situation permitted, but he wanted her to know that the intention was real regardless of the symbol. He told her he loved her, which she had known but not heard said in exactly those words, and the saying of it mattered. He told her that whatever shape his life had taken before was not the shape it intended to be, and that he believed with everything he had that the shape it intended to be was here with her, building something that would last. He asked her to marry him. She said yes. She said it clearly and without hesitation, and then she said, "And when you find the ring, I want you to know that whatever you can afford is more than sufficient, because the gesture has already been made, and it was made honestly, and that is all I have ever cared about." He looked at her with his eyes full of something she did not have a word for, something between gratitude and wonder and the specific emotion of a person receiving something they had not let themselves believe they would ever have. "Abigail," he said, "I spent 12 years telling myself that I didn't have enough to offer anyone." "I know," she said. "I understand now that what I was really saying was that I was afraid," he said. "Afraid that if I tried to build something and love someone and put down roots, it would be taken away like everything else was taken away." "Nothing is guaranteed," she said softly, "but refusing to try does not protect you from loss. It just ensures a different kind of it." He was quiet. Then he said, "Where did you learn to see things so clearly?" "From my father," she said. "And from paying close attention to the mail." He laughed again, that full and real laugh, and she thought that making him laugh like that would never get ordinary for her. They married in the Harlow's Crossing Church on the 14th of December, 1882. 8 months to the day from the morning he had walked in with a bullet graze and too much pride. The ceremony was simple, and attended by the full width of what their life in the town had built Clara and the Reverend and his wife. Old Harris Calloway with his rheumatic joints, and his absolute refusal to sit down for the ceremony, because he said a man ought to stand for important things. The Mendoza family in their finest. the Hartley family who came from out on the creek road with their 3 children, various townspeople who had come to know them both across the months. Abigail wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and she carried a small winter bouquet that Clara had put together from dried flowers and what was still growing in the Reverend's wife's kitchen garden. She walked down the aisle on her own, which prompted a few raised eyebrows from the more traditional attendees, and she did it because she wanted to, because she was a woman who arrived at her own choices under her own power, and because her father was not there to give her away and she would not have wanted any substitute performance of that particular tradition. She was giving herself, and she would arrive to do it on her own feet. Levi stood at the altar and watched her come down the aisle, and whatever was on his face in that moment, the complete and uncalculating openness of it, was something that Clara Whitmore later said she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. The vows were the standard ones of the Methodist Church, but when it came time for Levi to speak his, he added quietly, in the space the Reverend allowed, that he promised to listen to her as well as to protect her, and to trust her judgment as well as to offer his own, and to be honest with her about his fears instead of making decisions for her on their basis. It was not part of the prescribed ceremony, but the Reverend was a man who knew when the spirit of a thing mattered more than its form, and he let it stand. Abigail said her own vows with her eyes on Levi's face and meant every word with the full weight of a person who does not make promises lightly. They had a small celebration at the store afterward, because it was the largest gathering space available, and because it felt right to celebrate in the place where everything had begun. Someone brought a fiddle and someone else had a harmonica, and the reading room table was pushed aside to make space, and they danced, which was something Abigail had not done in years, and which Levi did with the careful concentration of a man who had not danced much but was determined to do it respectably. They were not elegant. They were better than elegant. They were joyful and real, and it went on until well past any hour that the cold December night ought to have permitted. When the guests were finally gone and the store was quiet, they stood in the middle of the room together in the lamplight, her head against his shoulder and his arms around her, and the particular silence of a concluded thing, not an ending but the very beginning of everything. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard, as Texas winters could be even in the southern reaches. Not the brutal white cold of the north, but a gray, persistent chill that got into the bones and made the days short and the evenings long. They were grateful for the evenings. Levi had moved from his rented room at the boarding house into the living quarters above the store that Abigail had been occupying alone since her father's death, and the space, which had always felt slightly large for one person, proved to be exactly right for two. He brought his few possessions, his books, a good saddle, a rifle, 2 sets of clothes beyond the working ones, and a photograph of his mother and father taken in Missouri before the land was lost, and she found space for all of them without making it feel like an imposition, which she thought said something about how thoroughly she had made room for him in her life before his things arrived. They learned each other in the close quarters of a shared life, all the small and revealing details that courtship, however attentive, cannot provide, how he made coffee too strong and how she made it too weak, and how they had eventually, after several weeks of negotiation, arrived at a ratio that satisfied neither of them perfectly and both of them adequately, which she thought was a fine metaphor for marriage generally. How he was a light sleeper and she was not, and how she could sleep through the wind but not through silence, and how they arranged themselves in the bed like a system that had found its equilibrium. How he read in bed with a lamp he angled carefully so it would not disturb her. How she talked through problems aloud when she was working through them, and how he had learned to provide responses that were thinking, with rather than fixing for, because she did not need her problems fixed. She needed to be heard while she resolved them herself. He was, she discovered, a man of considerable humor when he felt safe enough to show it dry and precise, and often delivered without any change of expression, which made it funnier. He discovered in her a talent for genuine stillness when she chose it, a capacity to sit with a thing and let it be without forcing it toward resolution, which surprised him, he said, because she had always seemed to him like a woman of constant forward motion. "I learned it from my father," she said. "He said the best postmaster was someone who understood that some letters need time to arrive." He thought about this. "That might be the wisest thing I've heard about patience." "He was a wise man," she said. "You would have liked each other." "I am certain of it," he said. The spring of 1883 brought new growth to the reading room. She had doubled the collection over the winter through 2 estate sales and a donation from the judge, who was reducing his personal library, and trusted her to use the books well. The Wednesday discussion group had expanded to include 8 regular attendees and the occasional visitor, and she had begun corresponding with a woman in Austin who ran a proper lending library about establishing a formal exchange arrangement. The letters went back and forth with the particular energy of 2 people who had found in each other a shared professional purpose, and Abigail suspected this connection would prove valuable for years to come. Levi's arrangement with Calloway was formalized that spring as well, a contract drawn up by the judge that established Levi as the ranch's principal foreman, with a defined path toward a partial ownership stake in the herd over a 10-year period. It was not wealth, but it was the architecture of wealth, honestly built, and both men shook hands on it with the satisfaction of an agreement that served both parties fairly. When Abigail told him she was expecting their first child, in the month of May, he sat down on the stool behind the counter, the same stool she had directed him to a year and a month before, and was very still for a moment. Then he looked up at her with an expression she had no name for, something beyond what the ordinary vocabulary of happiness covers, something that lived in the territory of transformed. "Abigail," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am," he began and then stopped, and she could see that for once in his life the careful man who always found the right words had been rendered briefly wordless. She came to him and took his face in both hands and looked at him. "I know," she said. "Me too." He put his forehead against hers, and they stayed like that for a long moment, the store around them full of the smell of pine soap and ledger paper, and the particular quality of light in Harlow's Crossing on a May morning, everything ordinary and everything entirely new. Their son, Edmund James Sheridan, was born on the 1st day of December, 1883, in the room above the store, delivered by the town's physician with Clara Whitmore in attendance because Abigail had requested it, and because Clara was the kind of friend who arrived before she was asked. He was healthy and loud, and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined mouth. And when Levi first held him with the specific careful terror of a large man holding something small and new, he looked at the child for a long time without speaking. And when he looked up at Abigail, his eyes were wet, and he made no attempt to hide it, which she thought was progress of the best kind. They named him Edmund for her father, which she had suggested, and James for Levi's father, which he had not expected her to propose, and which made his voice rough when he thanked her for it. She told him there was nothing to thank her for, that it was simply right. Old Harris Calloway came to see the baby on the 3rd day, thumping up the stairs with his rheumatic joints and his best hat and a handmade blanket that had belonged to his own mother, kept in a chest for 60 years, which he handed over with the gruffness of a man performing an act of considerable tenderness. He held the baby for 10 minutes while making the low, rumbling sounds that elderly men make at infants, and pronounced him satisfactory, which from Harris Calloway was approximately equivalent to declaring him magnificent. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was spent in the warm and complicated fullness of new parenthood, which was nothing like the general description of it, and everything like the specific reality of it, exhausting and extraordinary in equal measure, full of the small revelations that come with watching another person exist for the first time. Edmund was a curious child from very early, alert and interested in everything around him, and Levi devoted himself to the boy's exploration of the world, with the patient and thorough attention he gave to all things he genuinely cared about, which turned out to be considerable. Abigail continued running the store, adjusting her hours in the earliest months and returning to full capacity by spring, with a system of shared responsibility that she and Levi worked out together. He took the early morning hours before riding to Callaway's. She managed the main part of the day, and the baby was present in the store in a crib behind the counter that became a landmark in the community. A point of visiting and comment, and the occasional unprompted opinion on his development from the town's older women. The reading room had by this point established itself as a genuine institution. The discussion group met fortnightly. The exchange with the Austin Library was in place. 2 young women from town had begun using the space to practice their reading privately before joining the group, which was something Abigail had quietly encouraged without calling attention to it, understanding that learning has its own dignity and does not require an audience to be legitimate. Maria Mendoza's eldest daughter, Rosaria, who was 17, had been using the reading room regularly and displayed a particular talent for mathematics and rational argument that Abigail had noted carefully. She spoke with Maria about whether Rosaria had any formal education path available to her, and Maria said carefully that she had not expected such a thing to be possible given their circumstances. And Abigail said she intended to correspond with the normal school in Huntsville about scholarship arrangements, and that Maria should not consider the matter decided until they had explored it properly. It took 8 months and 6 letters, but Rosaria Mendoza received a scholarship offer the following autumn and was in Huntsville by the spring of 1885, which was, as far as Abigail was concerned, one of the most satisfying outcomes of anything she had undertaken since opening the reading room. She was aware that the world was not fair to people like the Mendozas, that the injustices built into the structures around them were not resolved by a scholarship or a water rights ruling, but she believed, as her father had, that individual instances of fairness fought for and one mattered, that they were not nothing, that they built something even if they did not build everything. Levi agreed, and it was one of the things she loved about him, that his understanding of justice was neither naive nor resigned, but practical and persistent. In the summer of 1884, Clara Whitmore married the town doctor, a man named Arthur Pike, who had come to Harlow's Crossing from Virginia, and who loved Clara with the open and slightly amazed devotion of someone who could not quite believe his fortune. Abigail stood as her witness, and Levi shook Arthur's hand with genuine warmth, and the 4 of them had supper together regularly afterward, which was something that added a richness to the texture of daily life that Abigail had not known she was missing until it was present. The Callaway Ranch continued to grow. Levi's management was marked by the same careful attention and principled consistency that characterized everything he did, and the herd expanded steadily, and the operation became profitable in a way that it had not been for some years before his arrival. Harris Callaway, who was now well into his 70s, and slowing despite his absolute refusal to acknowledge it, began relying on Levi more fully, consulting him on decisions that would have previously been made alone. The old rancher treated the younger man with an affection he expressed entirely through increased trust and delegation, which was the Callaway language for love, and Levi understood this, and was grateful for it without making the old man uncomfortable by saying so directly. It was in the autumn of 1885 that Callaway's health took the turn that everyone who knew him had been watching for, with the particular mix of preparation and grief that comes with loving someone old. He did not decline precipitously. He had too much stubbornness for that, but he declined steadily, and by February of 1886 he was not able to ride, and by April he was not able to come downstairs, and he spent his final weeks in the large upstairs room of the ranch house with the window that looked out over the east pasture that he had loved best. Abigail visited him. She brought books, and the judge's newspaper when the judge was done with it, and the particular brand of company that Calloway seemed to value, direct and not sentimental, respectful of what he had built, interested in his opinions and not merely deferential to them. He told her once near the end that she was the best thing that had happened to Levi Sheridan, and she told him that she was not certain that was true, but that Levi was certainly the best thing that had happened to her, and Calloway looked out the window at his east pasture and said, "Well then, that'll do." He died in May of 1886. He had no family, as he had said, and his will, drawn up by Judge Pratt with Levi's knowledge and Abigail's careful witnessing, left the ranch and its holdings to Levi outright, not in the partial stake that the contract had outlined, but everything, the whole of it, land and cattle and the house and the equipment, and the account at the Harlow's Crossing Bank. The bequest was accompanied by a letter in Calloway's own hand that Levi read alone, and then folded and kept in the drawer with his parents' photograph, and never quoted from, but which Abigail understood had been important in ways that were not hers to need to know. They held a service for Calloway at the church, attended by a good portion of the county. He had been a landmark of the region, and people came from long distances to pay their respects, and Levi spoke about him briefly and well, saying that Calloway had given him work when work was needed and belief when he had not yet earned it, and that he intended to prove the belief correct. The room believed him. They were now, by the accounting of their world, people of substance and standing. Levi owned the Calloway Ranch, which was a real and productive operation on 300 acres of good cattle land. Abigail owned the store, which had become the commercial and cultural center of Harlow's Crossing in a way her father would have recognized with pride. They had Edmund, who was 2.5 years old and conducting himself with the energetic determination of a child who intends to examine everything the world contains. They had also, by this time, become the particular kind of couple that a community recognizes as foundational, not in any formal sense, but in the way that certain people anchor a place by being genuinely invested in it, by being there in the difficult moments as well as the easy ones. The Mendoza case had established that. The reading room had established it. The community fund, the honest work, the visible dailiness of their commitment to the place, and the people in it, all of it had built something. They moved to the ranch house in the autumn of 1886, which required decisions about the store that Abigail resolved with her characteristic practicality. She hired young Tom Hartley, the eldest son of the Creek Road Hartleys, to manage the day-to-day operations under her supervision, and she came in 3 mornings a week and remained available by note for anything that required her direct attention. It was not the same as running it herself, but it was the right evolution of the thing, and Tom Hartley proved conscientious and capable and grateful for the work in a way that made the transition feel like continuation rather than departure. The ranch house was large and needed work, and they worked on it together across the fall and winter, making it into something that felt like theirs rather than only Calloway's memory. She hung her father's good writing desk in the room she designated as the household office and correspondence space. Levi built shelves for the books, which had by now grown to a collection that needed room of its own. Edmund's room was painted a warm yellow because he had pointed at the color in the dry goods sample and said, with the decisive authority of a small person who knows what he wants, "This one," and neither of them saw any reason to argue with him about it. In the spring of 1887, Abigail discovered she was expecting again, and they received this news with the particular quality of happiness that is more settled and sure than its first iteration. Not less, but more mature, more rooted, more aware of its own weight. The pregnancy was comfortable, the birth easier than Edmund's, and their daughter, Catherine Maria Sheridan, Catherine for Levi's mother and Maria for Maria Mendoza, who had become family in the way that some people become family through chosen affinity, rather than blood, was born on a clear October morning in 1887. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's stillness, and she slept with a gravity that made visiting neighbors smile. Edmund received his sister with the solemnity of a 4-year-old conducting an important ceremony, presenting her with his second-best marble, and explaining to her patiently that she would not be able to use it for some time, but he wanted her to have it for when she was ready, which Abigail and Levi both privately found to be one of the most affecting things they had witnessed. The years settled into something that was not uneventful. The frontier was never truly uneventful. There were always the ordinary and extraordinary dramas of a community in the process of becoming, but something that had the deep stability of things properly built. The store continued to grow under Tom Hartley's capable management and Abigail's steady oversight. The reading room expanded to the small adjacent building that had once been a storage shed, with a window she insisted on installing for the light, and it became a proper lending library with a formal arrangement with the State Educational Board by 1889. The ranch prospered. Levi hired 2 additional hands by 1888 and expanded the herd, and his reputation for honest dealing made him the neighbor that other ranchers sought out when they needed advice or mediation, which was a role he filled without seeking it, and wore with the modest authority of someone who has simply done what needed doing long enough to become trusted. Judge Pratt finally retired in 1888 and was replaced by a younger man from Dallas, and there was the predictable adjustment period that came with any change of authority. But the new judge proved principled, and the transition went smoothly in the end. Clara Pike, she was Clara Pike now, and had been for 4 years, had 3 children of her own by the time Catherine Sheridan was born, and the 2 families lived in the particular proximity of genuine friendship, the kind that involves knowing each other's households and routines and troubles and joys with the easy familiarity of long shared time. Clara's oldest and Edmund were the same age, and occupied the complex social territory of children who are simultaneously best friends and rivals in all things, which provided endless material for the Sunday dinners the 2 families took turns hosting. Maria Mendoza came to visit twice a year, usually in spring and fall, and Rosaria had returned from the normal school as a fully certified schoolteacher and was teaching in San Antonio, and Maria brought news of her with the pride of a woman who has watched something she was told to stop hoping for actually come to pass. The injustice of what had been attempted against the Mendoza family in that spring of 1882 was not erased by Rosaria's success, but the success existed alongside the injustice as evidence that persistence and community and the stubborn refusal to accept less than what was right could produce real change in individual lives, even when the larger structures remained incomplete. Abigail thought about this often. She thought about all of it, the long work of making things better, the specific and personal texture of justice, the way that what you could do with your own hands and your own pen and your own principled presence in a specific place had value even when it could not solve everything. She thought her father had been right about all of it, and she thought Levi had shown her what it looked like when that belief was embodied in a person rather than just held as an idea. On the evening of their 7th wedding anniversary, the 14th of December, 1889, she sat with him on the porch of the ranch house in the cool early winter dark, with the stars of the Texas sky spread out enormous and clear above them, and the distant sounds of the land settling into night around them. Edmund was asleep. Catherine was asleep. The house was warm behind them, lamplit and full of the smell of the supper they had made together. He was sitting with her hand in his, as he had developed the habit of doing in quiet moments, not performing the gesture but simply doing it, the way people do things that have become necessary. She leaned against his shoulder. The old cottonwood at the edge of the yard was leafless against the sky and very still. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed. She thought about the morning he had walked in with blood on his shirt, and the stool and the book and the long, careful unfolding of him across those first weeks. The man who had told himself he did not deserve to stay anywhere, who had tried to tell her she deserved better, who had been so thoroughly and lovingly wrong about what he had to offer. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly." "Always," he said. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Truly. Not are you content or are you grateful, though I hope both of those things. Are you happy?" He was quiet for a moment, and she let him be quiet, knowing that his answers were worth the time they took. The wind moved across the land and the stars were very bright. "Yes," he said. It was simple and complete, and she knew it was true because he said it with no qualification and no caveat and no shadow of the old careful self-denial. Just yes. "Yes, Abigail, I am." She turned her face into his shoulder. "Good," she said. "So am I." He put his free arm around her and pulled her closer, and they sat like that in the dark for a long time. Two people who had found each other at the exact intersection of moment and readiness and willingness, who had built something real from that finding, who had made a life that had weight and warmth, and the kind of depth that comes only from years honestly lived together. The stars turned slowly above them. The land was patient around them. The house held their sleeping children in its warm rooms, and the store in town held her father's legacy in its careful shelves, and the ranch held Calloway's faith in its every acre, and all of it was theirs, not by accident, not by luck only, but by the particular alchemy of love that had been chosen deliberately and daily, by two people who had looked clearly at each other and at themselves, and decided that the truth of what they were to each other was worth more than the fear of losing it. She thought about something she had said to him once, in the beginning, in the sharp, clear voice of a woman who knew her own mind. "You do not get to decide that for me." She had been right, and he had known it once she said it, and the knowing had been the beginning of everything. She had decided. He had, in the end, let himself decide too. And the life they had built from those two decisions was present all around them, in the children, in the land, in the books and the letters and the long evenings and the Sunday rides, and the coffee negotiated down to a compromise neither of them fully liked, and both of them would not have changed, in all the thousand small and specific details of a shared life that add up finally to the single large truth of having loved someone well. The night deepened. The stars moved. The house was warm. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.